when the Apostolical Exhortation Amoris Laetitia was published, there was immediately a great polemic on the newspapers. There was a strong attack against the Pope. This attack concentrated not on Amoris Laetitia. Really, it had not very much to do with Amoris Laetitia. I suggest you to read this text. It is a beautiful text on the situation of the family in the world of today. That is a world under many points of view very different from the world in which I grew up, and even more from that of our ancestors. But all the real contents of Amoris Laetitia were set aside, and the discussion concentrated only on one point, on one chapter, chapter 8. Not on one chapter, on one page. No, not on one page, on one footnote. On a footnote in which the Pope speaks about the situation of the couples who are irregular, and says, you must not exclude them from the communion of the church. They are not excommunicated. Of course, they are public sinners. They are in a grave situation of sin. Nevertheless, you must not exclude them. You must enter into a dialogue with them. You must try to bring them back to the fullness of Christian truth. And in this dialogue, at a certain point, you must help them with your prayer, with your friendship, and it is not excluded you might give them the support of sacraments. That was the occasion of great scandal, and many people said, oh, this stands directly in contradiction with the tradition of the Church, with what the Church has always taught. And beyond this attack, there is a long story. It is the story of the controversy on situation ethics in moral theology, the neo school of moral theology, or the German school of moral theology. In order to, and then now we formulate the question, does Pope Francis stand in contradiction with the tradition of the Church that says that adultery, under all circumstances, without exceptions, is always a grave sin? This is the problem we want to address now. In order to address this problem, we must make a set of distinctions and also reconstruct a little bit the history of the problem. The history begins with the so-called situation ethics. What is situation ethics? Situation ethics is a theological school that arises, shall we say, immediately after Vatican Council. Well, every history has a prehistory, so I've seen some doubts in the eyes of Professor Saitamu, and yes, there is a prehistory, but let us set a starting point after the Council. And they say, there are not universal norms. There cannot exist universal norms that are valid always and under all circumstances. Because what we find in our conscience is a general precept to do what is good and to avoid what is bad. But what is good and what is bad is determined always in the concrete situation. Only in the concrete situation you can say whether something is good or bad. And there may always be exceptional situations in which a form of behavior that under normal circumstances is bad may become good. Under exceptional circumstances, what usually is bad can become good. Then we cannot have absolutely universal moral norms. Norms that are valid, the Latins say, semper et pro semper. This means always, now, and also in the future, now and forever. Or, if I can use here the German language, there is a subtle distinction in German between something that is allgemeingültig. Allgemeingültig means it is always valid. This norm is always valid. You cannot have any situation in which this norm is not valid. And what is gültig im Allgemeinen? Something that is gültig im Allgemeinen is something that is generally good, in most cases good, almost always good, but I cannot guarantee that it is always good. The critics of Amoris Laetitia, or rather, of the footnote number 351 of Amoris Laetitia, because this was the center of the discussion, said, well, Pope Francis has accepted the point of view of consequentialist ethics, or of situation ethics. Situation ethics and consequentialist ethics are two expressions that are not exactly equivalent, but are used very often as if they were equivalent. Why? Because situation ethics says very often, not all, but most situation ethicians say that you must judge the value of the action from the consequences. An action that under normal circumstances is bad may, under particular circumstances, have good consequences. And since it has good consequences, then it becomes good. The accusation against Pope Francis was he is taking the point of view of consequentialist ethics. And it is a break with St. Thomas Aquinas and with the tradition of the Church. And is a break with John Paul II, because John Paul II had written one important encyclical, Veritatis Splendor. In this encyclical, the Pope says clearly, there are some things that are always bad, and then that cannot, under any circumstances, to become good. Let us stop on this point for a while. Can we say, try to imagine, consider your personal experience. Can you say that in your personal experience there are some things that are sometimes good and sometimes bad? Can you imagine of things that under circumstances are good, under different circumstances are bad? Can you imagine situations in which, let us say, situation ethics may be right? Can you? You can. Yes. Me too. Will you tell us one such circumstance?
You want to hear an example?
Give me an example.
Okay. Sometimes it is okay to hit a human being. Sometimes it is not.
To what?
To hit.
To hit a human being. Well, it might be controversial. Let me make my example. Let me make my example. A few years ago...
Well, in self-defense, it may be okay.
Under circumstances, yes, I can allow you this. But less controversial is another example. 5 years ago, it was okay for me to eat tiramisu. Do you know what is tiramisu? You do, good. It is one of the glories of Italian culture. And it was okay. Now, it is not. Why? Because my physician explained to me that I have some heart conditions and I should slim down, by the way. And then what was good, or at least morally indifferent 5 years ago, today is morally bad. It is wrong. And we can make a lot of such examples. There are many cases in which really circumstances determine the moral quality of the action. And of course, St. John Paul II, St. Thomas, agree completely with this. Nevertheless, there are other circumstances in which it is always bad. Something is always bad. And can you imagine things that are always bad? I can. A genocide can never be justified. whatever the circumstances. The killing of an innocent human being can never be justified. It is bad in itself. And adultery is one of those things that are bad in themselves. It is a break of confidence between men and women, and especially in the light of the Christian revelation. My daughter is getting married on October 12th, in a few days. And I talked to her, trying to explain to her, well, of course she does know, but it is always good to listen from your parents. What is the meaning of what you are doing? You take the responsibility in front of God for the life of another person. In the act of marriage, if you consider marriage as a sacrament, also at a natural level, but in the sacrament it is extremely heightened. This woman, or this man, stands in front of God. And what is the great problem of life? Hope. You must believe that God loves you. God loves you. I take the responsibility of being a particularly faithful witness of the love of God to you. So that if I betray you, it is as if I told you, it is not true that God loves you. It is a kind of apostasy. It is a negation of the presence of God in your life. So that's the reason why marriage is so important, and adultery is such a terrible sin, especially when it brings to a breaking up of the marriage and to the abandonment of one of the spouses. So it is always bad. And that is the doctrine of John Paul II in, not so much in Veritatis Splendor, yes, also in Veritatis Splendor and in Familiaris Consortia. How is it possible to think that the communion may be given under circumstances to somebody who lives in a condition of adultery? It is a grave scandal, and the Church, until John Paul II, had a prudential judgment. You will never give the Holy Communion to anybody who lives in a condition of adultery, at least of open adultery. We must, however, now introduce a different element. A person who lives in an irregular condition is always a sinner? It seems, yes. Adultery is bad in itself. It cannot be justified under any circumstances. And then, yes, how can you give? You cannot give the Holy Communion to anybody who is not in grace of God. Can an adulterer be in grace of God? And the old tradition of the Church tells you something that may change some ideas that we have developed up to now. In which sense? You all studied the Catechism of the Catholic Church, I suppose. Perhaps not the old Catechism, the big book, but the small Catechism of St. Pius X is sufficient. What does it say? It says, to have a mortal sin, you must have two elements, or three. I prefer to say two. You must have an objective element and a subjective element. Do you remember what we have said in the first class on the object and the subject? It comes back here. The objective element is the gravity of the action. And adultery is always a very terrible transgression against the will of God. But to have, it is not so easy thanks God, it is not so easy to commit a mortal sin. I have hope for my eternal salvation just because of the other side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that you must do it having full consciousness and deliberate consent. What is full consciousness? You must know that what you do is bad. And the second is you must give a deliberate consent. There are situations in which you are not free. And since you are not free, you cannot be held responsible, or at least you cannot be held totally, completely responsible for what you do. If we can exemplify the problem that stands in front of us, making use of two passages of the Gospel. In one of them, Jesus tells men should not tear apart what God has united. Marriage is indissoluble. The other is Jesus on the cross. Lord, forgive them because they don't know what they do. Here you have the objective truths of marriage, and then you have the importance of the subjective side. If God should not hold responsible, the responsible of the most tremendous sin you can imagine, the killing of the Son of God, then in each human situation you can have the hope that God will not hold us fully responsible for what we do. Can we imagine a situation in which a person stands in a situation of grave sin and nevertheless has not either full consciousness or deliberate consent? Does anybody of you? Cannot you? Well, I make you a proposal. Unfortunately, it is not an invented example. Unfortunately, it is a matter of fact, a situation that occurs in reality. And I shall not say very often, I hope not very often, but with a certain frequency. Imagine a woman who has entered into an irregular relation, but now is fully dependent on the man with whom she lives. Fully dependent means she's economically dependent, and she's psychologically dependent, and it is difficult for her to have the strength of character to say, no, that's enough. An historical example may help. In the ancient times, in Rome, in the ancient Rome, but also in the Middle Ages, I don't know among the Slavs, but surely among the Germans, and especially the Northern Germans, the Vikings, the servants were obliged to have sexual contacts, not only with the master, if he wanted, but with any person who wanted to have sexual contact with them. And when I say the servants, I do not mean only women, also male servants. Shall we hold them responsible? So you see that the situation is rather complicated. But we do not live in the Middle Ages. We do not live in the city of Rome. We live in the world of today. What is the level of consciousness of the value of marriage that have many people around us? You learn values not just because you listen to a professor who gives you a lecture. It may happen sometimes, but only for very intellectual types. Most people become aware of values. Poets may be a little bit more convincing. I do not believe that my classes on the virtue of chastity may have the force of convincing a young man or a young woman to practice chastity. If I think of Dante Alighieri, of the Vita Nova, of his poems, tanto gentile, tanto onesta pare la donna mia quando è l'altrui saluta, and so forth. My lady looks so gentle and so pure. Yes, that gives you an intuition of the value of femininity that may be an introduction to the virtue of chastity. But I don't think that many people would be convinced by Dante Alighieri either. We learn looking at the way in which our father looks to our mother. We learn being in contact with friends who practice a form of love, of conjugal love, that is convincing. And that then we understand, we interiorize the value through culture. Familiar culture, each culture has a family, each family has a culture of its own. National culture, the great poets. I don't know who is the great poet in Czech language who has written on love, but there must be, of course, more than one. You interiorize values within a culture. And what if you live in a culture in which those values are not recognized? St. Thomas Aquinas, who really was a genius, he was a genius because he could imagine things very different from the world he lived in. And he tells us there is in human nature, it is the same for all, but there is also a second nature. Culture is a second nature. And we experience culture as a second nature. Let us make one example. Imagine that, all men are frail and need the grace of God to be saved. But imagine a man who has received a good education, who has been the witness of a true conjugal love between his father and his mother, and he is strongly tempted and commits sin against the sanctity of marriage. It is something that has a certain specific moral disvalue. Now imagine a man who has received from his parents the idea that, love is not forever, love lasts until it lasts, love does not really exist, sex is real, love is not. It is better to break up before you suffer too much. He has received these ideas not from a source that stands outside of his culture. He has received it from the authorized sources of his culture, from the person to whom God has entrusted him, and it is natural for him to listen. Then you understand the complexity of the situation in the world we live in. Many people get married without really knowing what they are doing, and get divorced without knowing what they are doing. So in their consciousness, the value of marriage is not present. Now imagine that one of these persons has the experience of a conversion. He wants to go back to Christian life. He encounters a church movement, or he encounters a living community in a parish, or he wants to go back. And you have to reconstruct his humanity. And you have to reconstruct his humanity. What will you do? Will you first of all tell him, leave the women you are living with now? Or will you first try to develop the fascination for the person of Jesus Christ? And then step by step, you will arrive to the Ten Commandments, and the first, the second, the third, the fourth, and in the end, the sixth, the eighth, and the ninth, and the 10th. And in the meantime, what will you do? So you can have people who are in a situation of grave sin, and nevertheless, you cannot say they are mortal sinners. Rather, we should never say of a person that is a mortal sinner, or a sinner in general, because only God knows the conscience of the person. Don Giussani, who taught me most of what I do on the Christian faith, used to say, never be afraid to judge facts, to judge situation. This is good, this is bad. This fact is good, this fact is bad. Adultery is bad, and conjugal fidelity is good. Never dare judging the person, because you never know the heart of the person. Only God knows the heart of the person. Only God knows how much the person is responsible for what he's doing. Only God knows the pressure under which this person is, and how much freedom is in his action, and how much knowledge he has of what he is doing. And do not imagine that in this situation you would be better. Let us take an example for a completely different sphere. The killing of a human being is always a tremendous moral disvalue. I shall not spend words to explain this because it seems to me to be absolutely evident. And this is the reason why Pope Francis says the death penalty is always wrong. The killing of a human being is always wrong. Whatever he has done, a man has the possibility to change. And his life is a great value in front of God. And he might change, and the worst criminal might become a great saint. Nevertheless, if you are a family father and you live in a situation in which there is no police, no judges, no tribunals, no jails, no prisons, and there is a serial killer who is moving in your borough, perhaps I would kill him. It would be bad, but I would not too easily condemn this man, because I can imagine that I myself will do the same. Who knows? Yes, if you are a saint, God will suggest you another way of tackling the problem. But I'm responsible for the life of my family. And I cannot just wait for them to be killed. So, I hope that you see now the different dimensions of the problem. There are acts that are always wrong, in themselves wrong. In the language of traditional theology, you say they are intrinsice mala. There are things that are bad in themselves. There are things that are bad per accidens, because of some circumstances, some particular circumstances. Usually, the intrinsice mala are those actions that are forbidden in the Decalogue. In the Decalogue, you find two different kinds of precepts. There are positive and negative precepts. Positive precepts honor your father and your mother. There is no single action that can be considered as in itself good or in itself bad in this field, because you have many possible ways of showing honor to your father and to your mother, and there is also the possibility of seeing a more or less in the obedience to this precept. Do not kill. It is different. Here you have a negative formulation that corresponds to the fact that there is no situation in which you can kill a human being. And there is no single action that in itself is honor or not honor to your father. Also, sometimes to have a controversy, a struggle with your father on some issues may be a way of giving him honor if he's doing something wrong and you help him to avoid an error. In the case of killing, there are no such distinctions, as well as in the case of adultery and in a few other cases. So, can we say that the idea that in the pastoral care a priest sometimes can give the absolution to a sinner who is in a situation of grave sin, but is not fully responsible for the sin that is committing. The church said until Wojtyła, no. And said no in order to protect the faith of the people. If we allow a public sinner to go to communion, many people might think, well, that is not such a terrible sin, I can do the same. So in order to avoid any possible misunderstandings, the church said never. Even if the church always knew that there might be situations in which one is in a situation of grave sin, but nevertheless is in grace of God. And we all know people who are in an objectively wrong situation, but they are not thoroughly bad themselves. So you may have hope for them. There may be situations, and before there was this position to defend a culture in which the indissolubility of marriage was generally recognized. Then Wojtyła, and they were excommunicated. Not only they could not go to communion, they were not welcome in the church. The priest told them, you better don't come. Wojtyła, John Paul II, made a first important change. He changed the canon law, and in Familiaris Consortio, he said, no, they are members of the church. You must tell them to come. You must tell them to attend the Mass, to give a Christian instruction to their children. You can even take them as witnesses in marriages or on occasion of baptism. That is, they can even concur with the parents in the responsibility for the Christian education of children. But they will never receive communion. That is the situation. Now, shall we say that Amoris Laetitia contains a kind of general amnesty for the sin of adultery? Most emphatically, no. Those who were in a condition of mortal sin before Amoris Laetitia are in a condition of mortal sin after Amoris Laetitia. There is no change. Those who were not in a condition of mortal sin, although they were in an irregular situation, because they did not have the subjective components of the mortal sin, well, they were in a condition of grace before Amoris Laetitia, and they are in a condition of grace after Amoris Laetitia. What is changed is not the theology of marriage. The theology of marriage remains the same. What is changed is the law of the church. The law of the church is not the law of God. The church is a community, and in order to exist, a community must have rules. And in order to help people to obey to the law of God, we must make also human rules that help people to obey to the law of God. Nevertheless, these human rulings are human. They are set by a legitimate authority, and they can be changed by a legitimate authority. Really, we cannot say that Pope Francis changed this rule. He rather said that there may be legitimate exceptions to the rule. I see in front of me a young priest, and I must tell him that I know that I am putting on his shoulders a tremendous responsibility. Confession should not be a kind of bureaucratic operation. You must enter into the soul of the other. Ask yourself, if I say him, no, you will not go to communion, what will be the result? Will he feel called to make a drastic change in his life and to a deeper conversion, or will he feel non-loved, repulsed, and he will go away? What will be the result? Which responsibility can I take? What shall I do? And it is very difficult to give an answer. The only answer that I can give is that priests should be fathers. I have known in my life many priests. Some of them were lenient, some of them were strict. And there are good fathers who are strict and good fathers who are lenient. But they were fathers in the sense that they felt that they had a responsibility for the person in front of them. And they had to lead this person towards truth. And here there is a level that cannot be taught by philosophers. It cannot be taught by theologians. It is not a level that is the object of theological science. It is what the ancients called the sapientia cordis, the capacity to read the heart of the person. I have a great devotion to the Saint Curé d'Ars. He was not a great theologian. He had terrible difficulties in passing his exam of moral theology, by the way. But he had received from God this capacity of reading the heart of the people, the sapientia cordis. Some great saints are examples of this sapientia cordis. The Curé d'Ars, Padre Pio, another one, and many others. One of them is an Argentinian priest, by the way, who was canonized by Francis not long ago. Yes, it is a terrible responsibility, such a responsibility that no man can bear it without a specific help of God. Not by chance, the priests have a specific grace of God linked to the priestly ordination. It is the responsibility of being pastors and fathers. The moral theology did not change. The law of the change of the church, in principle, did not change. It has been pointed out that there may be reasonable exceptions. Before, what is the real difference? Before, those who were in an irregular situation were sinners, but not ordinary sinners. An ordinary sinner goes to confession and tells what he has lived, the objective side, but also the subjective side, and tries to formulate a judgment on himself with the help of the priest. Before, they could not do this. They were extraordinary sinners, half excommunicated, not wholly, no more wholly excommunicated, but still midway between being excommunicated with the interdict of entering into the church and being allowed to do the confessional to expose the situation of their conscience. Now, they are sinners like all others. They go, they talk, sometimes they receive an absolution, and sometimes they don't. And it is difficult to give general rules. Why? Because there are so many different situations in the world. Now, the situations are not taken to qualify the moral action. The situations do not qualify the value of the action. But the situations must be taken into account when you formulate a church law. What do I mean? You have in the world societies in which certain values are still strongly held. Everybody understands them, holds them. And in these situations, it may be wise to be stricter in order not to create a scandal. There are situations in which there is no scandal anymore because everything is a scandal and therefore nothing is a scandal. And you have a different problem, that of helping these societies to reconstruct again a kind of moral landscape. And in these situations, you should perhaps be more lenient. There are societies in which many people have no idea of what is marriage. There are societies in which many people do not have the correct also psychological balance. I discussed I am a great friend of some of the strongest opponents of Amoris Laetitia, of one of the strongest opponents. The strongest opponent is Joseph Seifert. The best, the strongest, not so much in the sense of the expression of feelings, but in the sense of the best argumented criticism of Amoris Laetitia has been done by Joseph Seifert, who has been one of the best friends of my life. And I told him, look, Joseph, the difference between you and me is that I got married to a psychoanalyst. It is incredible how many people cannot be considered really mentally healthy. They are adjusted to the situation, they can work, and since they can work, nobody enters into their lives, but they have really a disturbed situation that makes them very difficult to experience and see many important values. Von Hildebrand, by the way, I must compliment Professor Zeitam because he has just published a wonderful book on the ethics of von Hildebrand. I have seen the first copy today. Von Hildebrand.
Published together here with Lassa.
Oh, good. And then I congratulate him too. Von Hildebrand now calls these situations of moral blindness. Some people are blind for certain values. They don't see them. And then you must take into account the fact that they do not see them. Do those actions become good? No, they remain bad. Can we say, well, since he does not see that it is bad, it is good for him? We cannot say that. You have the duty, especially if you are a priest, you have the duty of bringing him to the recognition of the full truth. But you must do that in a human way, going through the process of a relation to the people. Perhaps the best defense, I think that the best defense of Amoris Laetitia is mine. However, if I were to name another defense of Amoris Laetitia that is even better than mine, more convincing than mine, I would make the name of Cardinal Alfonso Lopez. Alfonso Lopez Trujillo, you don't know him. The older, perhaps yes, but the younger, no. He was a very conservative cardinal. I think we could say he was a reactionary cardinal. And he was the president of the Papal Commission for the Family. And he has written a wonderful, small handbook of instructions for the confessors. Not on Amoris Laetitia, because Amoris Laetitia had not yet been published. On Humane Vitae, not only on Humane Vitae, general principles to be applied also in the case of Humane Vitae. And he recalls an old principle of moral theology that dates back, in the formulation that I am giving to you now, dates back from the 17th century, but in essence has a much longer history. This principle says the confessor shall not disquiet the conscience of the penitent, that is, shall not scold the penitent for a sin, an objective situation of sin, that the penitent is not able to recognize as such. He will prudently, progressively introduce all the elements that allow the penitent to see that it is wrong, and then he will tell him, you have to change your life. And this time can be sometimes a long time. This time can be sometimes as long as, almost as long as life. But you must never give up. You must never say, I shall not make contact anymore with these people. Of course, in this time, it is not given that that the priest should give him the sacraments. Probably not. Perhaps yes, under specific conditions. we have applied to this particular issue a methodology. It is a traditional methodology, but it is also a methodology that is the methodology of Wojtyła. And the reason why many do not understand, many that sometimes pretend to be disciples of Wojtyła, is that they have never really understood the philosophy of Wojtyła. John Paul II had to face a particular danger. This danger was situation ethics. And then he had to formulate the resistance to situation ethics. And some theologians have been his allies in this defense who did not share his fundamental position on moral theology. I mean here that in ethics, you may have two fundamental errors. One fundamental error is subjectivism in ethics. That is, everybody has his own truth. Conscience makes truth. And nobody has the right of criticizing another person, perhaps unless this person does not interfere with the freedom of another. Freedom makes truth. That's wrong. One could even question if that freedom is real freedom. You know how often somebody affirms his slavery as his freedom. I am slave of a situation that does not allow me to really develop the truth of my being, and I nevertheless say, I do that because I am free and this is the expression of my freedom. And so you have the right and the duty to say, no. What you pretend to be the expression of your freedom is not your true freedom. And in any case, it is wrong. Even if you freely affirm it, nevertheless, it is wrong. Wrong is wrong. I cannot compel you. I should not compel you. I should respect your freedom, your right of being wrong, but I have the right of telling you that you are wrong. And I have the duty of entering with you in a discussion on what is good and what is bad, what is true and what is false. But there is also the opposite danger. It is the danger of a moral theology that falls into objectivism. Objectivism is to forget that truth has to be interiorized. In Wojtyła, we have already said this, but only very shortly. It's good now to come back to it for a while. In Wojtyła, you have two different faculties in man. One of these faculties is the capacity of self-knowledge. I can know the truth about myself, and I can know whether what I am doing is true or bad, right or wrong. But this is not all. I have also a faculty to interiorize, that is, to feel that good as my own good. It is not only what is objectively good for me, it is what I accept as my good. And I identify myself with this good. This side is fundamental for the formulation of the moral conscience. I must assimilate, I must accept, I must interiorize the values. St. Thomas Aquinas says something similar when he speaks of virtues. Virtues are habits. Imagine the way in which we function ethically. Before making a decision in your life, do you stop and consult a handbook of moral theology to decide whether in this situation a certain action is right or wrong? It may happen, but only seldom. In most cases, to react immediately. The reaction does not come from your reason, does not come from practical reason. The reaction comes, we could say, from the heart, meaning with heart the general configuration of your consciousness. A boy is drowning in the river. You don't stop to think, what should I do? Also because if you stop, you are likely not to be able to do anything. The child will be dead before you enter into the water. You enter into the water. Why? Because you have your inner sentiment answers to the situation. Shall we fall then in the error of ethical intuitionism? Shall we under-evaluate the role of reason in the ethical action? No. But reason guides the ethical action, not in a despotic way, Aristotle, but in a political way. In a political way means I do not give you orders. I enter to mold, to give form to your heart. The process of education is the process of creating a rational heart, a heart that assumes what is good in itself, and so that passions act according to reason, not because they are compelled, but because they have been educated. You remember what I said a few moments ago on Dante. A good theologian can tell you what is the truth on human sexuality. But Dante makes of that truth something that becomes the form of your heart. And that is the problem that the Church has today. In one of his books on the Council, Wojtyła called it the subjectivization of the faith. And it is the problem of the Council. The objective truth did not change. What changed with the Council? That we stand in front of the task of subjectivizing this truth, of leading people to recognize this truth as their own truth. And we need to move with two legs, with two. We need to have two positions that seem to be contradictory, but really are complementary. On the one hand, the position of St. John of the Cross. I divest myself of the love of all created beings to recognize only the love of God as the true love. And all our other loves are, in one sense, derived from the love of God. But the other is equally important. I enter into the life of each human being to see and to show to him how the adequate realization of the passion of his heart, the way through which the passion of his heart can be really satisfied, is the obedience to the law of God. And deductive way and then inductive way. And they both converge. I wish to conclude telling you a story that is true. Do you know why God has created the human being male and female? Did you ever make a reflection on this fact? Once, John Paul II explained this to me. It was a little bit humorous, but in the end very serious. He said, well, God created men and women because the child needs to receive two different messages that only apparently seem to be contradictory. One message is you stand under the law. You are one like the others. You must comply with your duty. If you do not that, you will be punished. In order to affirm the law, God needed a father. And he created the father in order to have somebody who brings this truth to the child. But how sad would be the world if there were only this truth. And then God created mothers. Mothers tell the child, you are unique. You are my love. I shall never abandon you, whatever you do. Obey to your father, of course, but whatever you do, I shall always be with you. And in the end, I shall also bring your father to defend you. I will convince him to defend you. And that is the subjective way, going through the heart and beginning with human experience. The law and mercy. And one without the other is impossible to practice. It is unhuman. Law without mercy produces Pharisees. And mercy without law, irresponsible, sympathetic perhaps, but irresponsible people. Both of them together are necessary for the maturation of a complete human being. That's the reason why we need a moral philosophy and a moral theology that can consider at the same time both sides. The problem today in the church is that it seems that those who defend the law do not understand mercy. And many who defend mercy do not understand the law. And you cannot have mercy without law. Because the problem is to educate a mature human being. If you let him do whatever he wants, he will never grow. He will never enter really in touch with reality. He will never become autonomous. So mercy without law is not really mercy. Sometimes to be merciful means to be strict. I do not let you go to kill yourself. I do not let you go, I don't give you the drugs that you want to have. I tell you no. To say no is also an act of mercy. On the other hand, you cannot have law without mercy. The two camps now seems to be made of two different unilateralities. And they seem to be willing, more than search for truth together, they have a tremendous impulse to excommunicate each other. I am happy to say that I succeeded in remaining a good friend of my theoretical opponents. And this should be also in the church the rule. Pope Francis, it is an old idea of him. I remember having heard this in the 70s, but now he has repeated this in Evangelii Gaudium. He speaks about truth that is a polyedro. You know what is a polyedro? It is a solid that has many sides. You must defend the truth that you have seen. If I have seen a truth, I believe it is true. How can I doubt what I have seen? On the other hand, don't be too rash in saying that the truth of the other is wrong. The other may have seen the truth from another point of view. The principle of contradiction does not say that two propositions cannot be true if they are opposed to one another. The principle of contradiction says that two contradictory propositions cannot be true in the same sense and in the same moment. And so two contradictory propositions can be true in two different moments. Professor Butiglionne is here, Professor Butiglionne is in Rome. In two different moments, both propositions can be true. And there are also different perspectives, different point of views. And you really conquer the error of your opponent only when you see the seed of truth that is contained in that error. Chesterton said that an error is a truth out of order, that is not in the proper place where it should be, but somewhere else, or out of proportion. And if you look at the method of St. Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologica, you have a tremendous expression of a method that he listens to all the authorities, all those who have expressed an opinion. There is a problem. Let us listen to those who say that the answer to this problem is yes. Let us listen to all those who say the answer is no. And then I tell you what is the truth of the subject, but in order to show that this truth is true, that my position is true, I have to explain why those who had a different opinion expressed the different opinion. And I have to show you in which sense what they said was true, and in which sense instead it is not true. That is the conciliar way of the Church, the way in which we work together searching truth. I hope that this class of today is more contribution to a similar way of searching for truth together in a dialogue in which the communion is tested, but through this test grows. Thank you for your attention. Excuse me if I have been too boring.